Great. Thank you very much, comrades. Good morning. I think it's morning still there in Germany. It's an honor to be here and addressing you virtually all the way from Asia. The introduction, I think, laid out more or less what I wanted to discuss with you today, but of course we'll have the second hour to field question and answers. So I think since today it's also the Congress, your Congress that I'm speaking at, I wanted to bring some reflections on the Congress that the Communist Party of China had, which was held in November of last year, the 20th National Congress. And I think some things that were highlighted there around the contradictions, as Satya said, as well as some of the achievements. Congresses are important places to assess where the party has come and also chart a path forward in the next 5 years. So looking back, I think this Congress was particularly important because it was at the end of the 2 terms of President Xi Jinping. So in a way, it was a look back at the last decade. And within that, I would say the poverty campaign was a major achievement and a major challenge as well. So if we rewind back to 2013, 10 years before, when he assumed the presidency and also the general secretary position of the party, there was a story around Xi Jinping having summoned the key think tanks in the country to talk about the most urgent questions that were facing China, the pressing issues, the pressing contradictions. And then 2 key issues were revealed. One was around that question of corruption, which I don't think isn't any surprise to anyone that was a major issue and continues to be an issue that's being tackled. And the second was around the detachment of the party from the people, particularly at the grassroots level. So in a way, when we look back at the last 10 years, those have been 2 key areas of the party's attempt to sort of face those challenges around corruption and detachment. And I would say that this battle against poverty is a huge part of this reattachment of the party with the people and this reconnection in a mass level, on a campaign level, with the grassroots, particularly in the countryside. And at the Congress, one thing I want to point out is that, and this is, I'm quoting Xi in his report, he said that, and this is a quote, a decade ago, this was the situation that we faced. Great achievements had been secured in reform, opening up, and socialist modernization. At the same time, however, a number of prominent issues and problems demanded urgent action. And that's the end of the quote. And he goes on to talk about some of the challenges. This is the party's own self-assessments and self-criticism of what the state of the party was like 10 years ago, or the country, let's say. And he says that there was a lost confidence around socialism, and that there was questions around watered down party leadership, worries about money worship, or hedonism, or egocentricity, and also that there was a question of a development process that was imbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. So when you hear these words, these are really strong assessments of the party, of its own kind of shortcomings, the contradictions that the country faced 10 years ago. And Xi actually said himself that there's probably no area where he spent more time in to try to address than in this poverty alleviation campaign. So I'm going to dive in. I think what I'll try to do with my time is look a little bit at the historical process, but focus primarily on what we had studied and being able to visit the poverty campaign actually on the ground, going to the countryside and talking to party leaders, talking to peasants, youth, and women, and share some of our findings from that visit. But I think it's important to go into a little bit of the historical background to understand why this is really important in this question of this continued struggle towards national liberation, as Satya has framed it, but also just to build a nation that is strong and can overcome the kind of historical underdevelopment that China is still facing today. So on February of 2021, this was when the announcement that China had successfully eradicated extreme poverty. And when we look at that, it's China's always big numbers. It's kind of hard to conceive how big this is. A country of 1.4 billion is kind of beyond most people's imaginations. But just to give a sense, since the opening up of a reform period, or the last 4 decades, we've had 850 million people lifted out of extreme poverty. And on a global scale, that means that 76%, so almost around 3/4 of the world's poor that have been lifted out of poverty actually were lifted in China. So it was a huge contribution to the global poverty relief efforts. When we put that number in place, into context, that's basically the entire population of Europe, I think, plus another Germany. So if you imagine all of that, plus another Germany, which is a large country, lifted out of extreme poverty in just a matter of 4 decades, it's a real achievement that we should, I think, as socialists, as communists, as leftists, study and understand. Of course, I think a lot of comrades sometimes ask and wonder, well, is this achievement really because China is still socialist? Isn't it because of the market reforms? Isn't this the kind of conclusion that China has left the communist path? I think in some of the ways going down to sort of study how this was achieved is an important thing to understand the actual processes. So I'm going to share some slides here. Just give me 1 second because I realize that my battery is not charged in. Sorry.
Ich habe dich jetzt gemutet auch.
Okay,
Das heißt, wenn du was sagen willst.
Okay, so I'm going to let me know if you can see my slides. Okay. You're seeing it okay?
Disturbed.
Okay, great. All right. So I would say this is the 5 key takeaways after we had a chance to go down to visit the countryside, particularly in Guizhou, which is historically quite a poor province, one of the poorest provinces. And just so you have a sense, the last 9 counties that were lifted out of extreme poverty were all from this province. And these are the 5 key takeaways. And first of all, that China took an approach that wasn't like in many countries, especially in developing countries, where we have more of a cash transfer scheme or a welfare-based scheme, in terms of really it's about transferring money to the hands of the poor people. Because we know that cash transfer schemes can help alleviate some of the shortcomings in the short term, but not necessarily in a long, systemic and structural way. And I'll go into some of the details around that. The second was, and probably one of the most important and interesting things, was around the base building work, the party building work at the grassroots level that this poverty campaign was a part of. The third was around the capacity of the government to mobilize the whole of society. And what I mean by that is not only about mobilizing the party itself, but also the public sector, the private sector, and vast, broad sectors of society in this campaign. The fourth would be the importance of the role and the centrality of the peasants as protagonists in lifting themselves out of poverty, and not just as beneficiaries of a state policy. And finally, is to understand that the issue of poverty is an ongoing question of class struggle, and that the elimination of extreme poverty isn't the end goal as much as it is a historic achievement, but very much a part of this historic construction of socialism, and it's a stage that we were still in achieving the socialist development. So most of this that I'm sharing, you can find in the study that I'm sure the comrades can share with you afterwards, which has more information there. Okay, so on the historical process, and just actually going back in a second, we put this as part of a series as part of Czech Continental Institute for Social Research on socialist construction. And this is part of a series that we're trying to do about different socialist experiments in different regions. For example, the next one will be about the cooperative movement in the communist-run state of Kerala in India. So we hope to build on more of these experiences of very concrete socialist experiments. So In 1949, the famous quote of Mao saying that the Chinese people have now stood up with the proclamation of creation of the People's Republic of China, we have to wonder, what does it mean for the Chinese people to stand up? And I think the century of humiliation would probably be a term quite familiar to many of the comrades in the room, but to get a sense of what happened basically from the Opium Wars, where the city that I come from, Hong Kong, was ceded to British rule in 1842. We had these invasions of the French. We had basically most of the European powers were in and around China in different parts. We had the Japanese fascism and occupation that lasted 14 years, that claimed the lives of over 20 million Chinese people. And I think one of the things that get lost sometimes in sort of the Western narrative of the World War II history is how much the lives were really lost on the sort of Eastern, on the Asian theater, as people like to call it. And in China, it was one of the most brutal experiences. We had 35 million people who were war casualties, 20 million people who had died in fighting Japanese occupation. And so during that period, it means that from the beginning of the 19th century, when China was the largest economy of the world, we became the 11th poorest country in the world in terms of GDP per capita by 1949. So that's one of the direct results, not only the human life, but the economic cost of that century of humiliation. Just to give a sense, that means that in 1949, China there was only 8 African countries and 2 Asian countries that were poorer than China. So to understand this process of eliminating extreme poverty, we have to frame it in the long struggle for socialism that begins in this Mao era. And many of the things of the period of Mao, during his nearly 3-decade rule of the country, is that huge successes were already made in that early period, and without which we wouldn't be able to have this achievement today. And it's important to mention this. I actually have this picture. It's a picture I took in one of the people's houses, and you can see there's a picture of Xi Jinping, and next to it is a picture of Mao Zedong. And in a way, I think this is a good picture to capture for the peasant's life, how much these 2 leaders are important in this process of eliminating extreme poverty. So give a sense, in 1949, of course, not only that we were very poor, but technologically speaking, and we were very behind. We weren't even able to manufacture a car in 1949, but within 20 years, China already launched a satellite, which is named Dongsheng, or the East is Red. And in fact, actually, a small anecdote is that the first satellite that we sent actually played the song East is Red, which is a very famous revolutionary song, during its 28 days that it spent in orbit. So it was playing East is Red in the solar system, which is quite nice. But I want to highlight that is that there were important achievements from the technological level, industrial level as well, in that early period, which we don't usually associate with Mao because we think more about the land reform, the social gains, the literacy gains, the questions about women's liberation, but also in terms of technological, there were important advances made. But at the same time, we know that wasn't enough. Come 1978, under Dengsheng, the assessment was that as much as we've had those great advances in the early socialist period, China was still an extremely poor country. And one of the famous lines from Dongsheng was that, poverty is not socialism, still less communism. So the understanding is that the primary contradiction, moving from class struggle in the Mao era to the need to develop the economic forces and really resolve the urgent material needs of the people. And this is where we have the period of opening up reform. I think maybe in the question answer period, we can go more into that, since this is not the focus of this presentation here now. So, but we have to understand that these important achievements were already made, but each stage was very much required as a basis for the next one. Without the important gains of the Mao period, we wouldn't have been able to begin the economic and reform period. At the same time, and Xi, at the previous Congress, at the 19th National Congress, he had introduced that idea that we were entering a new era of socialism, and that there was a new principal contradiction being emerged. In Chinese history, since 1949, we've had three principal contradictions. One under Mao, one under Deng, which is about developing productive forces, and then the third now is how do we recognize and address this unbalanced and inadequate development in the country at the same time that the people have ever increasing needs. So we've already been able to achieve relative prosperity, but at the same time we have quite an issue around unbalance or inequality, in other words. So these are some of the numbers. I mean, I don't want to focus too much on the numbers. I wanted to share more today on the processes that I think probably is more interesting, but I think it's important to get a sense of what was achieved during the last 10 years, which is addressing the pockets of poverty or people who were in poverty where the opening up reform period didn't really reach. We understand that the large bulk of this, what we call the middle class or the middle income group in China was created during this opening up reform period. You know, now China has the largest middle income group or middle class of 400 million people. These are all people who have been lifted out of extreme poverty during the historic economic growth. At the same time, economic growth itself or incorporating market reforms does not resolve questions of poverty, especially in some of the most remote areas that were the least developed. And so this is why when Xi Jinping came to power, it was really important to get an assessment on the nature of poverty in the country and how you would have to use other means, very much led by the party, and a big sort of injection of a party cadre as well as resources into the countryside to achieve the eradication of extreme poverty. And so these are just some of the numbers of the scale of investment and also infrastructural development that were part of lifting the remaining nearly 100 million people from extreme poverty over the last 10 years. And I just want to note here, you can see in the title, it's called Targeted Poverty Alleviation, because this was a new campaign initiated by President Xi. And the reason when we think about targeted poverty alleviation, what that means is that we know that sort of at this stage of development, and I said the sort of economic reforms on a mass scale, weren't able to address the very targeted specific measures that need to be made for individual communities, individual families, and individual villages with their very particular conditions. So this is why they had to have a large really force of party members going down to the countryside to study, to live with the peasants, and also to work with the peasants in order that each family and each household is lifted out of extreme poverty. So I use this picture here because it became quite a famous example of one of the communities that were lifted out of poverty from Guizhou. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to visit it personally, but there were areas in China that were still extremely, extremely difficult to reach. These are communities that are in the mountains, very inaccessible. And so there was a limit also in terms of how much infrastructure can be built in order to reach some of the communities that were basically still isolated from the rest of Chinese society. And so one of the things is that the phrases, and you know, in Chinese policy, we like to use a lot of sort of poetic license to explain, but this was a quote from Xi to say, you can't use a grenade to blast the flea. This is why you need very, very specific measures that address the needs of a community like this, which is very, very remote, with very conditions that are very specific to it. You can't just have a massive economic stimulus and think that you will resolve the problems of this particular community. So the main gist of the program was in Chinese policies are always framed around sort of slogans with lots of numbers, and it's also a way of, popular education. It's easy to remember. So one is that it was one income in the sense that you have a basic income. Obviously, this is necessary. You have to establish an income line, which China actually used. The one that China used was actually higher than the World Bank standard, adjusted to the purchasing power in China, which is $2.3 a day. But more importantly to the income would be this 2 assurances and 3 guarantees, which is basically that you are assured food and clothing, and you're guaranteed the basic medical services, housing that is provided with safe drinking water and electricity, and then free and compulsory education, which across the nation is 9 years. In some regions, it can be up to 15 years. And so basically it's within this whole multi-dimensional framework that China considers a family or a household lifted out of extreme poverty when all these standards are met. So one of the important things is, how do you then go and find out about who are the poor in a country so big and so vast? And how do you do that? One of the things is that statistical sampling is going to be unable to give a good assessment. I just have this sun in my eye right now. I'm going to try to move it. So one of the things, the first step was in 2014, the party sent 800,000 members of cadre to go to 128,000 villages, basically to knock on doors. I think for anyone who, in the room, everyone's a comrade in the room, anyone who's done any kind of political organizing knows this is just going to the grassroots and literally knocking on each door and understanding the conditions of the families. It is from this process that took almost a year that the country was able to determine that there were about 100 million people or households that were still in extreme poverty, based on the metrics I just mentioned about the 1 income, 2 assurances, and 3 guarantees. And with that, that was the grouping that was entered into the campaign. And I think it's important, here, maybe this quote is important too. It's one that was famous that Mao used, this was really describing the People's Liberation Army, but I think it's the same, this concept of being a fish, being amongst the people is like the fish that swims in the sea, is very much revived in this campaign process, is that the party itself needs to be amongst the people to understand what the situation is and to be able to bring this campaign into fruition. And I think one of the things is interesting, and I also recommend, there's a good documentary online, it's available in English. It was created by, the name is called Voices from the Front Lines, China War and Poverty. It was a documentary made by a US filmmaker named Robert Lawrence Kuhn. It was jointly done between PBS, which is the public broadcaster in the US, and then CGTN, which is the public broadcaster in China. And to go into the details of that. But one thing that's of interest is that I actually had a chance to talk to the director, Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and this film, once it went into air in the US, was quickly censored from the US, and they had to take it down. I think one of the things is that now we're living in a situation of such media disinformation and really a media warfare, that films about China's poverty, talking about China, fighting poverty is becoming a censored issue, something that is, there's less and less space in the West to talk about. So this film ended up being censored and wasn't able to reach its audiences in the US in the end. But you can find it on the CGTN site on YouTube and other online platforms. But that being said, I took this screenshot from this film because this shows one of the moments of how sometimes I think people have, I think it's hard to assess how in the grassroots level, where, let's say, a different type of democratic processes can happen, especially those that are led by the party. For example, here is showing what I call the democratic appraisal sessions, where very much, it's not just the party cadre goes to the town and then decides who is poor and who is not. There is very much a consultative process that happens at the village level in determining not only your own conditions, but also the situations of your neighbors, your family members, and your community. So this is just, I think, a good moment how to capture that kind of democracy in action that happens at the grassroots level. At the grassroots level also, as a parenthesis, is where a lot of direct democracy actually happens in China. For example, the National People's Congress system that we have, which has 5 levels of government, at the village and the county levels, the people actually vote for directly vote for their leaders, which is something that I think gets missed about how sort of grassroots democracy happens in China. Anyways, I think I went on a diversion there. So with this process of determining that there were 100 million people living in poverty, there was a second phase where 3 million cadres were sent to the countryside. And this time it wasn't just for a temporary basis, it was actually to go and live and work in the communities. And I had a chance to meet with a few of them, and it's a very difficult condition. I mean, you're moved away from your own families, and oftentimes moved to a different province or a different region where you might not even speak the local dialect. And one of the reasons that you're sent, it's done that way, is also to avoid any kind of nepotism or, kind of the village dynamics. You're a party leader sent to a community where you have family members, you have relations, and it can be very complicated. So people were actually sent to communities that they don't come from. And how it works is that oftentimes one cadre will be paired with, say, 5 families, and during anywhere between 2 to 4 years of time, you'll actually work with each of the families and their situations to figure out a plan, a path towards exiting extreme poverty. And it could be a variety of things, from figuring out education to employment to with the larger village community, figuring out how to get investments to open a agricultural cooperative or a variety of things. I'll go into a bit more about the different pathways to that. But that being said, this was a major part of it, is to send 3 million people to live and work in the countryside. For a lot of people, it was very challenging. It's been a long time since there was a large number of people being sent to really experience what life is like there. As I said, people are living far away from their own families for a long period of time. And it's difficult, it's very challenging. And what they do is that these members are then paired with the local leaders to create what are called resident teams. So these teams together will create a plan for the entire village. And just to get a sense, I mean, the conditions were quite tough. During the 10 years of the program, over 1,000 people actually died, like party members actually died, oftentimes because the conditions were quite rough, or that they, just the rural villages were very remote, etc. And I met with a few people, and he would, to just give a sense, this one Secretary Liu that I spent the most time with, just to get a sense of what his daily life was like. I think there's nothing really glamorous about the work. Most of the time his phone was just ringing nonstop, people texting him, writing him. He rides an electric bike, basically goes and does his daily rounds every day on his electric bike, visiting each family. He says that a lot of times, in the beginning, people didn't trust him. He is a person from a different village, a different town. You have to go and earn your respect and earn your trust. It's nights of sitting around drinking tea or drinking baijiu, which is like the rice wine we have here, or getting to know, the conditions of every family member of the families that you're working with. And sometimes a situation like, Mrs. Wang's son doesn't want to go to school. or someone's, uncle is feeling sick, how do you address the very material conditions of the people? And yeah, so that's I think a little bit about what the lives of the cadres in the ground are. I think as one of the important aspects of this is that we see an increasing confidence amongst in the grassroots level and trust in the party. And I want to highlight one of the studies that was actually done by Harvard University from 2003 and 2016, so over a 13-year period, and it was published in 2020. And it was saying, and this is interesting, I brought this because, I think oftentimes people think that the Chinese media or Chinese reports or numbers are not credible, so here I'm using a Western one because it might be more credible. But the Harvard University did a report, and it put, after surveying for 13 years, over 30,000 people at all levels of society in different regions, that the citizens' support of the government, especially central government, actually grew over the years, and from 86% to 93%. So 93% is huge. It's almost hard to imagine, because I think in a lot of places there's a sense that, oh, well, the CPC must be an authoritarian, party. People don't have a choice to whether you're not to like the party, But the thing is, and also if you read the Western media, and I'm sure in Germany that's the case, it almost feels like every other day the people are about to revolt and overthrow the CPC, overthrow the government. But that's just so far from the truth, because in reality, people have high levels of trust of the government because, well, if you see how life has improved over not only in the last 40 years, but really since 1949, there's a huge amount of faith that things are improving. And even amongst young people, even though today, I think, post-COVID moment, the economy around the world has many questions, there's a huge amount of trust. And one of the things in the study that you can see is the increases of the trust in the party was more so in the countryside, in the poorer regions. And in a way, you can credit some of this reinvigoration of the party structures in the countryside, but also these massive campaigns to ensure livelihoods of people in the countryside have had also a direct impact on how people view the party, etc. Okay, so I want to go to the next level. I've talked a lot already around how the party has mobilized, because I think that's the most important. It's a driving force behind the success of any program like this. But the party alone can't resolve all these issues. And one of the things is when we say we're a socialist country, it's because it is a communist party in power that is driving and dictating, let's say, or guiding how the society moves. And one of the things is how to build what we call, of course, a united front. And I would say it was a united front strategy around the fight against poverty as well. And what I mean by that is that this was a state-led initiative, not something led by NGOs or which is often the case, and I think a lot of the global south countries, where we actually bring in not only public sector but also the private sector. We bring in the civil society, you bring in the military, you bring in the students, you bring in the academics, the doctors, and different ways to participate in that. And I want to give one example is what we call is this sort of East-West cooperation. Of course, one of the things that in the opening up and reform period, it was understood that you can't just industrialize a country so big all at once, across the board and with the same method. China experiments a lot, not only through economic zones, but also through pilot zones, trying in a certain region first, seeing how it works, adjusting, and then kind of bringing to other regions. So in the initial phase was very much focused on the eastern coastal areas that was already more industrialized and developed, and inject a lot of energy and capital into developing the eastern regions. And there's a very famous quote that often gets used that Deng said around, let a few get rich first. And I'm sure some of you have heard that, let a few get rich first. And I think sometimes we'll use this quote and say, oh, this is exactly a proof, that China is no longer socialist, the idea that have the billionaires, let them get rich. But I think it's disingenuous sometimes about how it's used because it doesn't represent the fuller quote of what he actually said. What he actually said was, let a few get rich first, who then have a responsibility to lift others from poverty. So this is, I think, in a way, after the initial period of opening up reform, when I say the East-West cooperation was that the eastern, more industrialized developed regions have now, under this poverty campaign, to contribute to the lesser developed regions. And so I'll give an example. I met with some people here in Guizhou that were paired with an eastern city in Jiangsu, which is a very developed region of China, and they had sort of this sister cities, which I know in many places they have the sister cities. It's more symbolic than anything, but here it's not symbolic. It's actually very material. So what did Jiangxi and Tongren, which is a city in Guizhou, have to do? The businesses in Jiangsu would be incentivized, or actually they had to invest in Tongren, the poor region in Guizhou, for example, this is here is a sort of like an eco-village development. So a Jiangsu company had to do investments, but not only investments there, but they also would send their workers for 2 to 3 years at a time, kind of similar to like the party cadres being sent, but this time it's from the private enterprises being sent to go and help and train people locally and live there in the villages for 2 to 3 years at a time. Not only at the sort of private level of trying to stimulate different kinds of economic development, it's also at the governance level. So the Jiangsu municipality actually sends their vice mayor to Tongren, that became vice mayor in Tongren for a couple of years as well, where there was an exchange of knowledge around governance and skills that were happening, which I think is quite interesting as a model. And within that, you'll also see various amounts of technical experts, professionals. You'll have pairings between universities from the two regions, so sending academics and students on particular research-based projects. You'll see that also around training of medical doctors, for example, that you'll get a free medical education, and in return that you would spend 2 to 3 years in a countryside giving medical services. So on many levels, that was this sort of united front policy of how to encourage private investment, university cooperation, governance cooperation, and across all sectors of society. So here are just some numbers, and I'm also conscious I think I'm nearing, no, I have about 15 minutes left. Is that okay? Maybe 15 minutes? Okay, great. So here I basically more or less what I said, but these are just the larger numbers. They're more in the study. I don't want to bore you too much with the numbers, but just to give you a sense that it was very large national programs thought across sectors around, for example, there were 17 million rural teachers that were trained, and 190,000 of them were dispatched to the countryside. This is just teachers alone. But if you cross that across every level, more than we can go through right now, you get a sense of the mobilization of society that had to be done in order for the campaign to be successful. Okay, so the 5 core areas of actually alleviating poverty on a village level, not just an individual household level. The first, of course, is industry. It's around productive capacity. In many of the regions, it was around consolidating or sometimes reconsolidating agricultural cooperatives, knowing that during the opening of reform periods, a lot of the farming capacities were downloaded into individual household responsibility, and how to sort of collectivize by creating cooperatives as one of the strategies. But in addition to that, it was very much about connecting the countryside to the urban markets. And now in China, it's a big part is around e-commerce. So for example, how do villagers directly market their own products to the cities? For that, it's not only around needing internet, for example, and 5G access. A lot of very common now how people on TikTok selling their agricultural products to people who like to eat healthy food in the cities, for example. But that means it's also the logistics infrastructure, the roads, and the interconnectivity, basically ensuring that there is the infrastructure to connect the countryside producers to the cities. The second part is called ecological compensation, which is a funny translation, I think, but it's really around how do you not only address one of the real contradictions that came out of the economic reform period, which is the environmental devastation, whether it's air pollution or the deforestation or a variety of pollution that came about. And the country has really taken this quite seriously. For example, with the desertification problem, and I live in Beijing where there's a lot of the effects of desertification impacting the city because of the dust storms and everything. So a big part of it was around how do you create new green areas, not only reforest, but also create new forests. And also in the process, generate jobs for people in the countryside in this. So hundreds of thousands of jobs were created in the last 10 years, linked specifically to tree planting. And actually one thing that I think is not known too much to people is that 25% of the new forests created over the last 20 years, so a quarter of all new forests created in the world were actually created in China. So there's been huge investments. I think there's still sometimes the image of China, of like the pollution of 20 years ago, and very little to see how much that has been changing. And this was also incorporated very much in the last 10 years in this poverty alleviation campaign to create jobs through the restoration of the environment. The third part is a vitally important one is of education, which is the most sustaining a contributor to alleviating poverty, to break the cycle of generational poverty. And so huge investments were made to build not only new facilities, but improve old ones, train new educators. I just mentioned about this whole idea of training rural teachers, but also dispatching urban teachers to the countryside. And to give you a sense in terms of the kind of leapfrogging in terms of higher education, over the last decade, 70% of the first-year students in universities in China were the first in their families to ever attend university. And 70% of those people come from the countryside. So this is a huge leap for access to higher education for people from the countryside in terms of generational, but also regional, sort of urban-rural question. And amongst that, we actually have more women now in university than men. So there's been a huge rise also in the gender gap, which is inconceivable when you think back to 1949 when, women were not in schools, basically. The two other means is, of course, social assistance had to be strengthened. Social assistance very much, a lot of the existing programs of the early Mao period were weakened substantially in the opening and reform period. So this was an important aspect, especially for those who are unable to work, people who have disabilities, people who are elderly or retired. And at this moment, not only in the countryside, but I think on a national level, it's a big question and a big worry for many people because as China is entering an aging society, we are looking towards having, in the next year, 300 million people aged above 60. So the question of how to deal with the health costs, but also around the pension costs is a really big question and the big challenge for the next years to come, next decades to come. And the fifth method is relocation. And I know sometimes this can be kind of controversial around relocating, and I actually spent the most time visiting people who either didn't want to relocate or did relocate to the new communities. And in the study, we spent a bit of time looking at one of the new relocation communities. Because for about 10% of the people in the program, about 10 million people, where that were identified as living in extreme poverty, they lived in conditions either were extremely remote that it's impossible for proper state intervention to resolve the issues there, like the kind of more extreme situation of this community I showed you earlier, has had to climb this stairway up to heaven, let's call it. Or they were very prone to disasters. There's about 10% people have to move to new locations. And for this, about 10 million homes were created. And I had a chance to visit, and very interesting because, there's nothing that the party can actually just do to force. It's none of this was done with force, but very much convincing. And I talked to one family because a lot of the elders have lived their whole lives in the countryside. They're not interested in living in the city. It's, let alone in a building with an elevator, with, crosswalks. All of these things they've never seen before. And it takes a lot of convincing. And one of the things that really helps convince the elders to move to the cities is that, one, it's an important chance that they can actually live together with their families. Because in China, in a lot of the poorest remote villages, people have to migrate to cities to find jobs. So it means that sometimes parents don't see their kids for long stretches of time. It becomes a big social problem for rural communities. And it's a question, I think, for a lot of rural communities around the world, this question of migration to cities for work. So one of the things is a reunification of families. And the second is really around what conditions the future generations can have. Instead of walking maybe 2 hours to school each way a day, you now go downstairs, walk 5 minutes, you get access to school. Same for a health clinic, same for a variety of, just for cultural life, educational resources, etc. And no less that the conditions of the houses are much better than they would have been living in the countryside. And one of the things I thought was quite touching was that in the community, this one I visited, which had 18,000 people living there, they organize these programs where they incentivize young, mostly teenagers in the community, to be adoptive grandchildren. And what they do is they go accompany elders to experience their first. They call them 6 firsts. Again, we really like numbers. 6 firsts. For example, the first time you use an elevator. So you have your adoptive grandchild to help you, how to use it. Because it's quite scary. If you've never seen an elevator, don't know how to use it. There's all this alienation that you feel moving into a city. Or, first time crossing a crosswalk, understanding how to cross a crosswalk. You've never seen that before. Or, and a variety of how do you go to a supermarket and pay with your phone, a lot of things like that. And one of them is also around how do you, taking them for the first time to go sightseeing, like doing a tourist activity, which is inconceivable. So this kind of measures, I think, are really interesting on how to address this real, I think, it's a real emotional and sociological shift of moving from being a peasant and then living in a city. And it's not without difficulties. But these are some of the things I think the communities were developing to help with that adjustment. And what is, I think, telling is that this was a few years after the community had been built. And out of 18,000 people that lived there, only one couple decided to move back to their home. And they were allowed to, of course. And they were both, as a couple, both had disabilities, and they couldn't adjust to the urban life, and they decided to move home. But I think that's something telling that of this large community. It's only one, I'm not saying I went to all the communities, that this adjustment was actually much smoother than I actually imagined. This is one of the biggest areas I had personal questions about how it worked. Okay, so I think this is wrapping up. Oh, this is the elevator that I was talking about when I was going touring. And this is one of the, maybe I'll end here, is that I spent a lot of time with Ying on the left, and so she is a woman that is a good, interesting example of who was kind of a protagonist in this situation. So she, for many years, was a migrant worker in another city. So she only got to see her kid maybe once a year during the Chinese New Year. And so she, in the process, decided to relocate. She didn't know anything about the party before. It was a community that didn't have very active presence for a long time. And she made decisions to relocate because she just had her second son, and she didn't want to relive what she had with her first son, which was basically living like remotely for most of his childhood. This is her second son now, going to the school right in the community. And in the process of her relocating, she actually became a party member. And so she not only was sort of convinced in the process of that this is a good program to participate in, because it was good for her family and the future generation, but she was also inspired to join. And now she's one of the 11 party leaders in the community of the 18,000, and also the head of the Women's Federation. And she was telling a really interesting story because at first when she got politically active, her husband, especially with a more conservative, rural mentality, still very patriarchal, was very suspicious of her participation, because it was, she was now doing political work, now caring for, hundreds of families. Is she maybe not doing her duties to her own family, etc., in terms of within the domestic life. But one of the things that really shifted his opinion, it was during the COVID period when he saw how much the party at the community level were the main force organizing and protecting people's lives, and that was a shifting moment for him. And now she's the main party leader in the community, and what is really amazing is that her older son, that she didn't get to live with for most of his childhood, is now studying in a nearby vocational school. Vocational school is kind of like the community college. Instead of going to university, it's more going to sort of the trades or something like that. And he's studying elevator maintenance and she's really proud of him because she says, well, our community has 64 elevators, and she really hopes that he can come back and help serve the community by being the elevator maintenance. And I think that's a really nice rounded story about, this whole transition, this process of thinking generationally, but also the process of becoming protagonists in your own life and becoming politically active, because it takes this process of your own, let's say, subjective transformation and also your material transformation of your life. So I think with that, I'll just end it there, and then we can open up for discussion. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Tings. That was a very enriching input on the concrete struggles in China. On the one hand, you provide some very concrete perspectives. For example, the community that was relocated, the next generation of that community were for the first time able to attend schools at a 5-minute distance. And I think these are, for example, struggles or concrete issues which are very much non-existent in countries like Germany and in West. And for example, what does it mean when children are not able to easily access education? What does that mean for the society as a whole? And on the other hand, it shows the entire poverty alleviation program that it was a comprehensive program. It was an all-encompassing program where all or major sections of the society were mobilized, the party, the private sector, the state sector, to execute this program. And very interesting also, it had, of course, now it's very much understandable that it had ecological aspects to it, it had social assistance aspects to it. And I also really like this slogan, this phrase, don't use a grenade to blast a flea. I think this, for a country, for a huge country like China, geographically huge, than 1.4 billion people, with its own very specific contradictions, its specific history of colonial past. What does that mean? Very much shows that we cannot have template economic policies to tackle the issues that are there in these specific contradictions. And I think this is equally valid for the struggle for socialism also. I think for me, this slogan is very much very much an important guiding line to understand the so-called question of China. We'll now open up the discussion for the audience. We'll do it this way. We'll take 3 questions and then you answer, and then we go like this. You can also raise your point in German. We can also translate that. Okay. So Anna, then second, and then I think third here, and then we continue.
Thank you very much for your presentation on this important question. So my question, I don't know if you can answer it because I know you're not an economist, but you dealt a lot with the question of the development in China, so maybe you can... Yes, oh, you don't hear it? No.
It's muted. How though?
Zoom,
No. Well, then just use this one maybe.
Can you hear me now?
Du musst einmal drücken.
Now? Can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Okay, perfect. So I was going to thank you first for your remarks. So my question is a bit in another direction. I don't know if you can answer it, but you dealt a lot with the developments in China, so maybe you can. So for me, it's still a big question if those, because the market reforms, of course, enabled dynamics that are not that easy to control. Yeah, for example, the whole speculation, I read it, that it's especially in the building sector, there was a lot of speculation, and we know that in the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, this housing and building sector was a crucial point. So, and we of course know that those dynamics of the market are not that easily to get controlled again. So for me, it's a big question if it's possible to get them under control again. And I mean, obviously, also one important point you stated was that China is a really huge country, so it's even more difficult to get the control of all those things. And then there's also foreign capital that has some influence and so on. So maybe you could say something. I mean, I know it's a big question, but maybe a little bit on what's your opinion is on it, or how this issue is tackled, and also that's maybe a second question to this. How the discussion in the party is about this, because obviously this is really important, and we also there's now maybe this meeting coming up with USA and China, and we see that there's some talks, and I think we can't underestimate the soft power of the USA to try to kind of get into the process and get rid of the progressive people in especially an important country like China. So yeah, those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Hans-Peter, Bolshevik Tendency. My questions or remarks kind of link directly to the market reforms. I mean, the amount of prep you hear about China and so on, including from a lot of the left, who've basically just bought into capitalist lies about, oh, you know, the Chinese economy is going to collapse tomorrow, and supporting COVID protests in China is great, but if they happen here, everyone's opposed to them, that kind of stuff. Or, you know, Xinjiang genocide, and it's ridiculous. But I think in terms of the economic development, obviously, I see China in a similar situation to the early Soviet Union of the new economic policy, in that the core is still party controlled, is still planned of the economy. During the last financial crisis, that was very evident when all the capitalist countries' economies collapsed and the Communist Party rolled out massive infrastructure projects and so on and so forth. And the fact that sometimes the Communist Party makes big state-owned enterprises swallow little ones, so that the little ones which aren't economically viable, that the workers can remain in employment and get wages and so on. These are all very important achievements that in the West, when we are unemployed, we get nothing, and you can see that also in the living life expectancy, which now in China is higher than the US. But obviously the problem is that the CPC has fostered the capitalist sector and sometimes operates as an enforcer of capitalist exploitation. Illegitimate strikes, for example, are prohibited. Deng prohibited them in 1982, which is unlike, for example, the new economic policy under Lenin, let's say, who pointed out the necessity of strikes being permitted under certain conditions, particularly against the capitalists in the capitalist sector of the economy. I think from a broad perspective, that causes problems because there are, even though there are wage rises, a lot of them in Guangdong province, for example, a lot of them had to be fought for by illegal strikes, and I know that the Trade Union Federation is also forcing nowadays foreign-owned enterprises to rise wages, but it's very much the Communist Party walking the tightrope, and Xi in his 100-year anniversary of the Communist Party speech basically said, we're not going to wind up the capitalist sector at all. We're going to support the private sector, and that poses huge problems, and that again poses a bigger question of I fail to see a strategy of. I agree that we shouldn't take the few remarks of Marx on communism and say, oh, China isn't that, so it can't be communist, but nonetheless, they must be seen as the end goal, I would say. I fail to see how the CPC is enabling that, and so I'll leave it there.
She wants to answer now, or maybe she asked.
Do you want to answer directly, or do we take the third question and then
I think we can take one more and then I can answer.
Okay.
Hi. First, I'd like to thank you a lot for your patience to Western ignorance. I appreciate it a lot. My question is on China's role in the anti-imperialist struggle. As you know, when Trump came to power, the DPRK, or North Korea, had tests of ballistic missiles. And the UN Security Council imposed sanctions on North Korea. And my question is, why does China support those sanctions on North Korea? Why can't they just say, we have a veto power and this is our fellow socialist country, we would never support those sanctions. What is your take on this matter? Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much for the questions. Okay, I hope I can adequately answer them. They're really important ones. On the question around, I think it was around market reforms, housing speculation, but also how does China or the party control the capitalist forces, really, and has it gone too far? I mean, I think this has been one of the big questions. Even when Deng was alive, he was very worried about the polarization and the extents that the reform would go, and to what extent, how far does the opening up go to? Which areas can you privatize, and which areas can you not? How do you say that the party is still in command? And I think one of the things in the last 10 years have been very interesting, especially in the last 2-3, that I think give a lot of those of us on the left quite a bit of confidence. So I'll use one of the key concepts of the last 2-3 years that she has been repeating a lot is this idea of a disorderly expansion of capital. It's very interesting vocabulary. He's not saying we're doing away with private capital. I mean, of course, if you go back to Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, we know that socialism is this transitional phase where we're resting by degree, right? Resting by degree from the hands of capital. So we don't know how long this path will take. We don't know how long this stage exists in. We are still very much in that phase of coexisting with capital. But what is this disorderly expansion of capital? And we've been seeing in some specific areas where we would say there has been high extreme levels of exploitation, a certain degree of, let's say, entering into the realm of politics or wanting to enter into the realm of politics. And I'll give a very concrete example, which we had a chance to talk about in my podcast, which is around Alibaba, because I think it's somewhat, Jack Ma and Alibaba is more well known in the West as one of the, almost the epitome of Chinese private capitalists. Of course, for those of you who don't know, Jack Ma is the CEO of Alibaba, or the larger Ant Group, which is a conglomerate, not only as an e-commerce platform, but also a variety of everything, media companies, film productions, beyond the logistics, mega company that it is, owns newspapers, retail chains. And this is a good example of what the policy in place of what controlling disorderly expansion of capital would be. And so Alibaba had grown into a $100 billion company, and it was beginning to do a lot of financial transactions, because in China we basically are a cashless society at this point. Really, it's all digital payments. And just to get a sense, there's 1.3 billion people a billion users on Alipay, which is their e-payment. It's a massive platform that processes trillions of dollars per year. And so it started doing a lot of micro lending as well, predatory lending, a variety of different things, and starting to basically behave a bit like a financial institution without obeying many of the rules of a financial institution. And right before, in 2020, it was about to get listed as on the financial stock market of Hong Kong, Shanghai, the joint market, and it was going to be the largest IPO, initial public offering, in the history of capitalism. It was massive. And so you can imagine some of the most wealthy people are backing this company to be publicly traded. And 2 weeks before this happens, the government basically steps in and says, no, this is not going to go ahead. We have some questions about how this company can run, and basically went through a series of investigations around monopolistic practices. And what's interesting, this is, I think, a very particular Chinese characteristic of how the state operates. It doesn't collapse the company at all. What it does is basically over the last 2 years has been completely restructured, broken into 6 separate companies that have 6 separate boards, over a lot of government oversight. Several of the areas that have been seen to have monopolistic practices have had to be controlled. In particular, has been restructuring of its financial practices and a variety of things. I think for many of us, this moment back in 2020 was pretty shocking to see, And it was a good vote of confidence of when the government comes to step in. It doesn't matter if it's upsetting a lot of the big capitalists, the biggest capitalists, let's say, of China, when this is a moment of asserting sort of politics over capital. But I think what we've actually been seeing is in a variety of sectors, the last 2-3 years, this has been coming in, particularly in the privatized sector of education. Something similar happened essentially overnight. The government comes in and says this sector of the privatized business can no longer be marketized in the way it is. The education has to be a nonprofit enterprise and has to be taken back from being hijacked. This is what the Ministry of Education said, hijacked by capital, and a huge hit to the private sector in private tutoring sector. But we're also seeing this as well in areas of the privatized sectors of the medical health system, and a variety of areas, which I think is giving a lot of us leftists quite a bit of confidence that when that sort of extremes come to, or this sort of expansion of capital, the government does step in to kind of reel those sectors in and there, and even in measures that might seem quite harsh, but in terms of upsetting capitalists, but we're not that upset about it as people. I think that the housing thing, I don't know how to get into because it's such a big question. I know one of the things is when the Evergrande crisis came out in 2021, or 2022 really, a lot of people were predicting that this was going to be a kind of Lehman Brothers situation in China, and this would cause a collapse of the Chinese real estate bubble, but it hasn't yet, even though the real estate sector is going through a big crisis. One of the things is that there are many different measures of state intervention, especially in the role of state-owned enterprises in controlling the real estate crisis. For example, when Evergrande came to with its $300 billion in debts, Beijing basically came in and asked the state-backed companies to buy a lot of the assets from the builders. And not only that, is that the local governments were asked to step in to control its revenue. So basically, I think it's 9 different local governments now control the revenue of Evergrande, even though it's a private company, and it's sort of money flows. Many of the large assets, like, I don't know, soccer stadiums, football stadiums, were bought by state-owned companies. And this helped resolve some of the liquidity issues. There's many different ways that the government can sort of intervene through different state-owned sectors without just allowing, let's say, a huge company like Evergrande to just collapse overnight. That would never happen. China would never allow that to happen because there are more state intervention means than you would see in a capitalist society without a full sort of bailout or a full private nationalization of a company, let's say. But beyond that, I think there is many structural reforms that need to be made and are starting to be made around the housing crisis. And just for you to understand why this is not an easy structural question to resolve, it's not just about bringing the developers in line. It's more of a question of local budgets. So in China, because the state owns the land, what the state sells is the right to use land. So you sell the rights to use it, and that becomes income for the local governments. And this is a fundamental to the real estate structure of China. What it means is now local governments are highly dependent on the land use sales for their budgets. You know, on average, it's 40% of local government budgets. But some cities, 80% of the local government budgets are based on this. So to be able to reverse this sort of structural problem of, you know, basically relying on the real estate sector to generate your income, there are now new pilots being put in place of how to, for example, create a property tax. It's been 20 years. China has been debating how to implement a property tax, which we don't have. It's very complicated. You know, that as a way to substitute some of the income questions for local governments. There's been other questions of how to relax some of the residency requirements between where you come, where the hometown you registered in and where you live, to be able to flexibilize some of that. There's a big structural questions in place to resolve in longer term the housing crisis. That is not just about resolving liquidity of the developers and state interventions in different ways. It's probably bigger. We could have like another 3 hours just on that topic. But I'm gonna not go into that question too much longer. I just wanted to emphasize that there have been really important interventions that the state is making on this disorderly expansion of capital in specific sectors, and then also on the housing, that there are different measures that can be put in place. Now I'm kind of losing my track about what the other questions were. Okay, core of the economy was planned economy, right? And then also rural strikes. Let's see. I mean, I think one of the things is, it's true. I mean, even with the opening of reform process, we didn't go through sort of the shock therapy of the Soviet Union or anything like that, because we went through a very gradualist method, and also it's the idea of you keep the strategic sectors like, for example, the banking or energy. None of that was ever privatized. It's very much in the hands of the state and was strategically never allowed to be privatized. But we let go of the small and other sectors. In the beginning, technology is one of them, have become a huge, mostly privately driven, let's say, sector. So I think that's an important aspect to emphasize. And also why we see in these moments of averting crises, the state can step in certain ways. And the rural strikes and protests, I know there was a lot of focus and interest around the anti-COVID protests. And I don't think that's the main crux of the question, is that there was, I think, in a period, especially around the opening of reform, that, and this was also led by them, to say our focus right now is to increase the productive forces, and there was a huge cost paid by the working class, no doubt about it. And there was a period also of basically entering what's called the no debate period, that there was coming out of a pretty volatile period, such as the Cultural Revolution, and into the late 80s leading up to Tiananmen, huge amounts of, I would say, quite a bit of ideological confusion in that period of time. And it did enter a period of basically a no ideological debate period. But I don't want that to be confused with today, and also the role of, like, how do you say, role of expression of discontent. There's actually many means that people do. Protest is not an uncommon thing. Last year, Zhejiang, there was 3 rural banks that were going into basically they were about to collapse. And huge protests were organized by a lot of the people who banked there in the communities. We see these kinds of protests actually happen quite often. They're not, I think people don't get to see that protests are not that uncommon as you might imagine. Of course, we're not talking about large organized strikes in the factories. That's a different question. But I don't want people to have an understanding that people don't have any rights to express discontent. And I would also say another thing is that there is a huge amount of public debate also online, and the government actually pays quite a bit of attention on public opinion that's voiced online. I'll give one example. 2 years ago, there was a pretty horrendous incident that circulated online about basically these women who were in a restaurant that got attacked by men that were, sexually harassing them, that they decided to sort of fight back, and then they got beaten up. And the videos from this circulated, and it became a huge kind of public uproar, especially amongst women around the country. And this kind of public sort of circulation discontent can actually stimulate government action. Oftentimes it does. And in that case, that really pushed forward the government actions to deal with not only the perpetrators involved in that particular incident, but some of the structural questions around police corruption in the local community, especially around avoiding issues of violence against people, not only women. I'm giving that example because that became a social media phenomenon, but I can probably name, a dozen of those that happen every year where a huge amount of public, consensus gets developed and outrage gets developed, and there is government response quite quickly. And these are things I think that in the West people don't get to see. They might be unconventional in the ways that kind of dissent or discontent gets voiced in other places. But it certainly does. I mean, this is always some of the pressures. It almost seems like 1.4 billion people can not have a voice or can be, silenced with a heavy fist, but it's just not quite like that, actually. On the third question about anti-imperialism and support of sanctions in North Korea, I think this is one of the really, of course, China has, on the Security Council and has the veto powers, but that's a difficult space to be in order of how you use your veto powers and many things. I think China has been very outward around challenging a sort of US-led hegemony or US-led West and what it means for the sovereignty of nations across the global South and across, in terms of whether it's in the form of sanctions, in the form of direct war and occupation, in the form of media disinformation, and a variety of ways that the U.S.-led hegemony has on the sovereignty of peoples and nations around the global South. I would say the biggest thing that China is doing around challenging imperialism today is around strengthening different platforms where global South countries have a voice. And I know there's a lot of, I think, Western and leftist even skepticism about what is the nature of platforms like BRICS and now the expanded BRICS, or this is just as a platform for capitalist countries of the global South to unite. And I think one of the things is, if we understand the stage of imperialism that we are at, the process of national liberation did not get realized with the formal independence of the countries of the global South. Very much immediately after the formal independence was the domination by the neocolonial order, which is through the IMF, the World Bank, and the neoliberal order that was imposed on our countries. But that means that we haven't ever been able to really overcome the historical underdevelopment that came with colonization. So these platforms like BRICS today is a very important one that allow for countries to even begin a discussion of how do you overcome the question of the huge debt burden that's been put in place because of the neoliberal decades that we've been living in, or the hegemony that the dollar has over our ability to even trade or invest or negotiate as a sovereign nations with one another. For example, BRICS being one of the leading forces now discussing not a de-dollarization path, not so much that you can bypass the dollar now, but at least to think about being able to settle trade in national currencies. Like, that seems absurd today, that's almost impossible to do. And, what are the new mechanisms to basically wrest ourselves from a world system that is not in the favor of the development of our countries? But beyond that, we are seeing real substantive, I think, platforms like the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been a huge, let's say, contribution of the last 10 years, which we have over 150 countries of the world, mostly from the global South, having access to investment technology and a possibility to develop the critical infrastructure that's needed, that hasn't been, very much provided through the other means, the exhaustive means from the World Bank and IMF, etc. But then the list goes on. We have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is more in the Central and West Asia. We have the FOCAC, which is China and Africa. We have CELAC in Latin America. So there's a lot of, I think, multilateral institutions outside of the orbit of the West right now that are being strengthened, and China has been playing a big role in this. And this is part, I think, of let's say, a broader anti-imperialist struggle, or at least creating more space for global South countries to be at the bargaining table, even. Sorry, I went on really long with those answers.
Okay, can the people who raised their hand in the last round raise their hand once again? Okay. Okay. You, then Julian, then Jasper, and then after that, maybe you, and then Max. No, first him. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your talk. My name is Saithor, and I'm visiting from Iceland. And I have a question more about the organizational structure of the party. From my participation in politics and also as a union leader, the reason we seem to have so little control of our democracies in the West is because none of the political parties have active participation with deep details, and that seems to be the main difference between the communist parties of the world, especially in China with 95 million members. I've had the opportunity to meet two Chinese tourists who have been members of the party for 10 years each, and I asked them each how often they meet, and one was 4 times a year and the other was twice a month. And compared to the political parties in Iceland, that's several 100% more than we meet. But when I talk about this to Westerners as the corollary to non-participatory bourgeoisie politics, they don't really believe that the Communist Party is functioning like that it is more like a way to get your career ahead, and that there isn't actually policy being made in these meetings and these committees, that it's kind of like a more statecraft or a liberal Bonapartism from Xi or the party to kind of like earn love with unconnected policies that benefit people that they didn't necessarily ask or force, but that they get and benefit anyway. And were it that could be copied by Western parties. They could just start to legislate kind of like Putin is doing now with policies that benefit the working class, but they didn't really have control over this. So what would you say would be your argument for someone who is skeptical that the CPC is having all this power because of the active participation of the members? Someone who is skeptical or doesn't think it works that way.
Hi, thanks for your lecture as well from me. I wanted to ask about the discussions in the party, because in the interview and the podcast you said that you follow the discussions inside the party also, about allowing capitalists into the CPC. From what I've read, they're also in the National People's Congress and also in the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the CPPCC, which, from my understanding, is just an advisory board, but they also seem to be, like deputies to the NPC, and I wanted to ask what the discussions in the party are about this currently, and when this was introduced to allow capitalists into the party, because to me it seems like having them in the party and as deputies in some, in like the council, like the National People's Council, is one of the ways that would trigger a lot of corruption that we see today. And so I was just wondering what the discussions inside the party are like. And the second question would be, because you probably can bridge this gap quite nicely because you lived in Canada, so in the West, and also in China. I wanted to ask what things you think that Western communists can learn from China that can also be specifically applied in the West. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for the great talk here. I have a question. I mean, I had a lot of questions, but some of them were already addressed now. So I focus on a question regarding the actual course of Xi Jinping. So, in my understanding, the politic he's doing is, he described it as maybe overcoming the unbalanced development. But in my understanding, he's also standing for a political course that is more anti-Western than the course of Deng Xiaoping before. And so recently there were some changes in the staff of for example, the foreign minister Kim Gang was replaced by the former foreign minister Wang Yi, and regarding the brutal sanctions that the US are organizing, especially in the technological sector, my question would be, are there signs for maybe change of this anti-Western course towards a more pro-US, pro-Western course in the actual government in China right now? Thank you.
Tings, would you like to make this the last round, or would you like to have one more round?
Maybe we can try to close off here, if that's fine, because I know I talk a lot, so I'll try to keep it short. But
All right.
Okay, good questions. I think, yeah, the CPC is an enormous organization. It's actually now closer to 98 million, I believe, million members. So that's as a country, it'd be the 16th largest, most populous country in the world. So it's massive. And it's not to say that all of that organization is mobilized, heavy, it's not, and I don't want to give that impression. This is why I think focusing on the poverty alleviation was such an important, let's say, activation of a sector of the party, reinserting them into the countryside, and that was an important, let's say, using the terms of Mao, revival of the mass line. For the party too, understanding that yes, for many years there are many party members who have a party affiliation and aren't actively engaged, like in many different parties around the world. That is for sure. Beyond that, beyond these large-scale campaigns that have really reactivated a sector of the society, was also, the fight against COVID was a big part of that. That was a huge mobilization of the party at the grassroots, at every community level across the country. What we're also seeing is very interesting is there was also a few years ago the establishment of a rule that's saying basically at any institution, including private companies that has more than three or more party members working there, that they can create, and they should create, a party branch. So we've seen an increase in sort of the party activation and creation of branches in the private sector of the last years. And that has been an important way of sort of creating a party presence in the private, not only the public sector. That being said, I think in terms of activity, I think the CPC is a very particular organization. Just for sort of, what do you call disclosure, I'm not actually a member of the CPC, so I'm not talking about saying I have inside information as a party member. And how people get actually recruited in the party, actually to start very young. Usually people get recruited at the high school level, recruiting people who are at the top of their class. Into the youth league, and then later on maybe in universities. So there's no doubt that the CPC is very much for a meritocratic model. People who are excelling at the schools, excelling at the universities, and become part of that. And a lot of people do enter thinking that, okay, this will also help me. Of course, it's a party-led, government. In terms of future prospects, this is also a good thing. There's a lot of pride in being a party member. And a lot of thinking around, yes, this will help my future career and things like that. So all of that does exist. I'm not going to say it doesn't exist. But I think what is important to know is that there's been a really important, I would say, a shift in energy around mobilization of party members in the last years that I think we should, keep in mind. Beyond the actual party itself, there's many ways that people actually get engaged, and it's in the social organizations that are party-led. So in the country, there's about 5 million of them. This will be at every sector of society, at the villages, which I would have mentioned when, party members get sent there and then they work with the local organizations. This will be women's organizations or youth organizations or worker, peasants, etc. And also at the neighborhood committee. If you go to any Chinese city to Chinese village, every neighborhood has a neighborhood committee that's run by the party. These are all sorts of social organizations that are active in the life of people. We saw that a lot, particularly in the COVID period where those neighborhood organizations were highly active. So on the whole, I guess, I don't know, to understand this party, the skepticism around I don't know if that helps actually answer the question of the skepticism. I guess people have to just kind of come to China and actually understand how the party plays a role in every sector, every level of society. To really, I don't know, explain that. I don't know if that's a good answer to that question. I think in terms of the capitalists in the CPC, yes, it's true, there are capitalists in the CPC. It's not excluded to people who are in the capitalist sector. One of the things that we have been seeing, which is very interesting, and I think very much during the Xi years, is the decrease in their, let's say, influence or participation, whether it's in the NPC or in the consultative body, the CPPCC. In fact, there's been quite a few studies around people who are classified as billionaires, and the numbers dropping drastically of those who are the kind of very wealthy that participate in those political spaces. And that's been active, I think, active policy around removing the kind of influence around private capital in politics. And that's next to the large campaign, which I didn't really touch on, which is the anti-poverty campaign, anti-corruption campaign that's been happening in the last 10 years. Remembering one of the first things that she said when he came into the general secretary position was that he was going to look at corruption very seriously, not just attacking the flies, but also the tigers. And so what we've seen is a huge concerted effort across the different sectors of looking at corruption, and that's been really important. I know that many places, I think in the West, they look at it in a very cynical or skeptical way, that this is a campaign to consolidate the personal power of Xi. But I think if you look at it in a broader society and you actually ask an average Chinese person, they will say that next to the poverty alleviation project, which is really gaining a lot of the confidence in the countryside, but across the nation, especially in the cities, is a recognition of how much the anti-corruption efforts have helped people gain confidence to say this government is quite serious about not just getting the flies, but also the tigers. And we've had something like over 2 million members of the party actually being processed for corruption-related. Over 800,000 members of the party have been expelled for corruption-related offenses. But we see this on various levels, people who are including up to the level of the, central committee, many central committee members have been tried, former ministers, heads of banks. It's really been quite a thorough aspect, because no doubt that one of the major contradictions that came out of this rapid economic growth was this sort of allowing for corruption to really infiltrate many sectors of society and many levels of society as well. So that being said, in terms of the worries around capital and influence on the party influence in politics, there's been huge measures being made to sort of rectify that aspect. In terms of, I think I missed a bit of the last question about the pro-West, and maybe someone can repeat.
Yeah, if I understand it correctly, the question was under Xi Jinping, China has taken a more anti-Western stand compared to Deng Xiaoping, but with the recent resignation or replacement of the foreign minister, which was considered to be more anti-Western, with someone who is more pro-Western, if I understand correctly. How do you see that? Is China taking a different course? Is China taking a more, so to say, a compromising course with USA, or what's the tactic here from China?
I mean, I think one of the things is I wouldn't really frame him as an anti or pro-West in that framing. I think one of the things you have to understand is with the pivot to Asia from Biden, but really the trade war under Trump and then the increased antagonisms under Biden, there's been quite a bit of a series of aggressions led by the US that I think China has emboldened China to be really defend itself against a lot of whether it's the economic warfare or the informational warfare or the variety of tactics that are used that we know it's in the sort of hybrid warfare toolbox of the US. And I would say that China is not necessarily taking anti-US, it's definitely taking a much stronger position to stand up against the US, you know? And I think linked to what I had said earlier, very much that is coupled with putting priority primarily really on building relationships with the global south. So let's say maybe a pivot away from the West so much as anti-West. I mean, there's been no signals towards, oh, we are going to, none of the decoupling, or now it's called de-risking, which whatever that means, is coming from the Chinese side, right? So that there isn't a strategy to de-link from the China side. But there is a strategy of saying, if we're looking at, let's use the phrasing of Mao, who are our friends, who are our enemies, definitely going more to our friends and understanding that the strengthening of the Global South project is a primary responsibility and path. Yeah, I hope that kind of addresses the question. And nowhere has there been a kind of explicit anti-West sentiment, but at the same time, I think we're a different China than the period of Dengsheng, and the US and the West at large have now seen China somehow as a kind of existential threat because now it's reached an economic power that they had not imagined it could, and also on levels of technology and a variety of sectors that it seems unacceptable to the US at this moment.
Okay. Do you have time for one more question, or should we? Yeah.
Sure.
Then would you like to? Yeah.
I was in the first round,
Thank you very much.
Ganz kurzer Hinweis, bitte kurze Fragen stellen, weil wir haben nicht mehr viel Zeit.
Yeah. We very much appreciate the efforts of the Chinese, what we call deformed worker state, to erase poverty. It's a great achievement. Makes clear that it's not a capitalist-run country, but as we say, a bureaucratically deformed worker state. I would like to point out what we Trotskyists think is it's necessary to have a proletarian political revolution in China combined with a socialist revolution in Taiwan to counter the imperialist threat against all of China. And so what we see that the imperialists see now China has strengthened. It's not. It's a systematic enemy. They want to defeat this systematic enemy, and there is no peaceful coexistence between imperialism and workers' state, even if deformed. So what we see is the Chinese party says they want reunification with Taiwan on the basis of one country, two systems. And we saw already during the Hong Kong riots that this is a deadly threat to China, to the Chinese deformed worker state. It poses immediately the threat of inner counter-revolution. So maybe you can answer to that point.
Willst du? Ja.
Hello, saying thank you very much for your talk. My name is Dongsheng. Originally, I'm from Pakistan, but currently based in Berlin. I have two questions, and one question is related to your talk, and second question is more of geostrategic politics. Okay, the question related to your talk, you showed a successful example of relocation, but there are also ghost cities, right? So what went wrong there? So what was the problem that these cities are not populated? And second question is, you know that Western governments, they have their allies almost in every government, right? In opposition leaders, they support one actor against another actor, and it helps them to maintain their influence. But when I see in Chinese politics or Chinese international relations, they try to stay outside. So their policy is non-intervention, so not to intervene one party or another party. Do you say that in this time, this staying neutral and not favoring one party or another party is a good tactic? And concrete example is now Imran Khan, right? You saw that he was quite friendly or moving toward Russia, and he said openly that Pakistan's economic future is linked to China, and we can learn from China to elevate poverty and so on. But his government was sacked. So in such situations, the governments or the non-state actors who are friendly to China, so how does the CPC want to approach these actors, or want to say, okay, no, we will stay neutral? Thank you very much.
The first question, the sound was going in and out a little bit. I got most of it, but can someone restate the question for me?
Well, it was basically
The question was if there should be a socialist revolution in China and in Taiwan, and that he said that this is needed, and the one China and two systems is in that sense wrong, and should be one system, and a socialist revolution is needed in both countries.
proletarian political revolution in China.
I think to me that's more of a statement than a question, perhaps. But I mean, I can maybe give some thoughts to someone coming from Hong Kong. But maybe that doesn't, there's more perspective from Hong Kong. I think one of the things is, I mean, I don't think anyone in China is looking for a socialist revolution. We already had a socialist revolution, and we have a form of our own unique form when we say socialism and Chinese characteristics. So that's one thing I would say. In terms of what would be seen as the one country, two systems, I mean, that has not been yet proposed as the reunification path with Taiwan. It has been put on the table as a possibility given the 25 years of experience we've had of Hong Kong returning to China, and also Macau, which is where my mother's whole family is from, that returned later in 1999, which also has a one country, two systems policy. In a way, they are two examples of, we didn't have large protests and let's say, attempts that would color revolution elements in Macau that we had in Hong Kong, but they have their own histories of colonization and histories of development. That being said, I think we're in a moment now, since 2019, in the statement of the national security law, where a lot of the sort of unrest or the abilities of a lot of infiltration from the West, whether it's through the NGOs, through the funding or mechanisms and whatnot, and also the media information, which is really strong in Hong Kong, has been somehow at least controlled or curtailed. But it's going to be a long process. You have to understand that Hong Kong went through 156 years of colonization. That means 156 years of colonial education, British education, there's a huge cultural element still that needs to be resolved, and I think it's going to take some generations to create that understanding. There's been generations of families that have been separated from the mainland that don't have any connection with the socialist process. So we're waiting to see what the 2047 will look like. We haven't, I mean, as I said before, China's a very experimental country and learns from its experiences. So Hong Kong is the first example to do that. I don't know if that's going to be the same path for the unification of Taiwan, though we're very determined that unification is part of the long process of, let's say, overcoming what would be the center of humiliation, which isn't quite over yet because Taiwan has not been unified. On the question about non-interference, I mean, I think non-interference since the days of the 1950s has been a cornerstone of Chinese foreign policy, and I don't see that in any time changing. I think what China is being stronger at is being, around defending possibilities of national sovereignty, but I don't think in any case China's ready or going to. It doesn't matter what I personally think about it, but China has a very strong diplomatic tradition, which is on this non-interference question. But I think it doesn't mean it's sitting idly by while imperialism gets to do whatever it wants to do with other countries. And I think we see this when, joining and having a strong voice in the defense of the UN Charter, with groups of highly sanctioned countries and the UN, such as, Venezuela, Cuba, and amongst other countries, as well as building the other platforms I had mentioned, which are important, let's say, a non-interventionist way to intervene in the global world order that is clearly out of the favor of the developing countries in the former colonized world. So I think I would say that's the way, but I don't see the foreign policy changing anytime soon.
Okay, thank you so much, Tings. With this, we now come to an end of the discussion. Of course, the question of China has it raises a lot of questions, and it's not possible to go into it 2 hours, but still, thanks a lot, Tings, for answering these very diverse questions, and thank you a lot for your input. Very enriching, understood definitely some more points, more concretely, I would say, and also how one should approach the so-called question of China. And thank you everyone for being here. Before you leave, just one or two organizational points from Max.
Well, maybe first some round of applause.
Okay.